This video will show you how to turn your Onshape assemblies into amazing Blender renders like this. Alright, so I have this Onshape assembly right here. This is a dry base for my robotics team, and this assembly has a lot of different parts in it. It has like a bunch of imported parts, some custom parts, some motors with a bunch of weird materials with it. And I find that the hardest thing when importing anything into Blender like this is getting the materials right. Because when you import materials or import models from different places, all the materials are different. It just becomes a mess in Blender. So that's mostly what this is going to be about, just learning how to deal with that material kind of system with interacting with Blender and Onshape. The first thing you want to do is right click on your assembly here and click the export button. And then under the format here, you want to click on Parasolid. Once you do that, you can leave everything else the same. Make sure this is unchecked and then hit export. That'll go ahead and download your assembly. It might take a bit depending on how big it is, but it'll end up in your downloads folder in a little bit. Once your assembly finishes downloading, you want to head to your Onshape homepage. You can do that by clicking the Onshape logo in the top left corner. Go ahead and click the Create button and then hit Import Files. This will pull up your downloads folder, and you want to go ahead and upload your file. And this is a very important step. Make sure to click Combine into Single Part Studio. This is a very important step. And then make sure Import Appearances is checked, and you can leave everything else off. Once you go ahead and click that, it will import into your Onshape. It might take a little bit. This is a big assembly, so the importing time will take quite some time. Once your file fully imports, it'll make a document just like this. You can go ahead and enter that document. And then once you enter it, it has made a part studio with your entire assembly in it just like this. And it should look exactly the same as the assembly you downloaded. The one major difference is now that everything's in a part studio, you can go ahead and change the materials of all of the different objects in your assembly. This is going to save a lot of time because it is much easier to do this in Onshape versus Blender. And the reason we're doing this is because we want to make as many like materials as possible. A lot of the times when you import different parts from different vendors or different assemblies, all the materials can be very different. And it's really hard when you have like 1,000 different materials in Blender. So what we're going to do here is set all materials that we want to be the same to each other here. So the first thing I'm going to do is look for the material for this outer plate and then go ahead and apply that to like this inner plate. And this will vary depending on what kind of assembly yours is, but I'm going to go ahead and look here and look for outer plate. So here's outer plate. I'm going to go ahead and double click on the color, and I'm going to go ahead and copy this hex code. So just hit Control-C on your keyboard. And now I'm going to go ahead and try to find the color for the floating plate. Here's the floating plate. I'm going to go ahead and paste it in. Once you do that, now these are the same color, meaning it will only make one material in Blender for the plates that I want, because in my render, I want these both to be aluminum. And now I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing for this outer plate. Here's the other floating plate. I can go ahead and paste in the color, and now they're both the same. You should do this for pretty much anything you want to be the same color. So I'm going to do that for the screws and these cross beams. I'm going to do that for these spacers and the bearings on the inside. So if I go ahead and find something here, so let's see, this spacer. Yeah, so I want this spacer to be the same color as pretty much everything else. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the color from one of the screws and paste that into that spacer. And now I'm just going to scroll through and look for anything that I think would want to be the same material. So here's another spacer, which is this one. Go ahead and paste that in. Same for this piece, and then just go ahead and do that for all the different materials in your assembly. Once you have finished changing all of your parts to like materials, just to make it easier for us in the assembly, you can go ahead and right click on the tab, hit export. And this time, we don't want to download as a Parasolid, we want to download as a collada file. You can leave all of these settings off and then just go ahead and hit export. Once you open up Blender, you'll get to a splash screen like this, and you can go ahead and click out of it. If you've never used Blender before, I'd recommend checking out some other tutorials, but I'll try to do my best to keep it pretty beginner friendly. I'm going to hit the A key twice and then hit X on my keyboard and click delete. If you look on the bottom left here, there's this little screencast thing that'll tell you what keys and keyboard shortcuts I'm pressing. So that should be pretty helpful. The first thing we're going to do is install a add-on that's going to help us with material selection. It's a really good add-on and I really like it. So go ahead, go to your browser and head to blenderkit.com. Go ahead and hit this download button. Once you do that, it's going to download a zip file. Once it downloads the zip file, you can go ahead back to Blender, go to the Edit tab, hit Preferences, and then go to Add-ons, hit this little drop-down arrow, Install from Disk, go to your Downloads folder, and find that zip file it just downloaded. Go ahead, click Install from Disk, and then that add-on will be added, and you can see it adds this little toolbar right here, which will be very useful for us. So now that we have that, we can go ahead and hit File, Import, Collada, and we want to go ahead and find that Collada file of your assembly that we just downloaded. You can go ahead and double click on that guy. It'll take a little bit to load. And if your assembly is really small like this, because Blender's default scale is pretty big, you can head to this tab here, the Scene tab, go to the Units drop down, and I'm going to change my unit scale to 10, and that'll make the grid and everything else kind of scale a lot better. You can see that it imported the materials pretty well, but we're going to go ahead and change those from default just to make it really nice for realistic renders and stuff like that. The next thing we're going to do is start adding materials to all these different objects, and this is where that add-on is going to come in really handy. So I'm going to go ahead and select this outer plate here. This in real life is supposed to be an aluminum plate. So I'm going to go ahead and head up to our add-on here. I'm going to select the Materials tab and type in metal. And this add-on has a bunch of different materials, but I've found some ones that I like, and you can do a lot of exploring just to see what exactly you like. So as you can see here, it gives a little preview of the different materials. I'm going to go ahead and select this one. And as you can see, it didn't really apply here. You have to go up to these little dots up here. These are basically different views that you can view the 3D viewport in. This is like your clay model. This is a wireframe. This is like your render preview, which uses a simple rendering engine called Eevee. And then this is your full render preview, which we'll get to later in the video. So I'm going to go ahead and click this one. If you hit this drop down here, you can change the different scenes and different lighting. This isn't exactly how it will look in the final render, but it gives you a pretty good idea of what the material is like and how it interacts with light. So you can see this material looks alright. It looks like metal, but because this plate is so small, the texture is kind of zoomed in. It looks pretty blurry, so we're going to go ahead and fix that. If you head up to this little corner here and you click and drag, it'll pull over a split screen menu. These are really useful because then you can change it to, we're going to go ahead into the shader editor, and this will allow us to kind of do two things at once. If you hit N on your keyboard, it'll hide this little sidebar here. And if you get stuck with these two windows, all you have to do is drag from the corner and then drag down to the right diagonally, like this, to get rid of them. And you can do the same thing to open it back up. This is where all the different settings for your materials are. These are basically nodes, and they all do different things. This video won't get too into what they do, but this is like your base material. This color ramp is basically telling it to do kind of like a gradient with how rough the material is, like your glossiness. This is your bump map, so kind of how much the texture comes out at you in 3D space, and this is your color map. These two nodes kind of map it to the material, or rather the object itself, like the geometry, and that's what we're going to be playing with here. The main thing we want to adjust is these scale values, and you can adjust all three of these at once, but I have this little trick here that I like to do. If you hop on over to the Shift A menu, and then you hit search, you can type in combine XYZ, hit enter on your keyboard, and I'm just going to go ahead and click and add that into the node editor. Going to drag and place the vector into the scale here. I'm going to do Shift A again, hit search and type in value this time, and then click again. Once I do that, I'm going to drag value into all X, Y, and Z so that I can adjust all three of these with just one value here. When I go ahead and drag this, you can see that the texture is scaling a lot better to this material. And you can go up really high and make this super big, but then you end up getting this patterning effect where you kind of see the pattern repeat over time. So I'm going to make this a bunch lower. Let's see, something around like 40 or so. So that looks a lot better. And as you can see, it's a much better texture. So now what we're going to do is go ahead and apply that to the rest of the objects in the scene. And the way we're going to do that is this little trick I know, and this is going to be super easy if you follow the instructions in the Onshape and making sure they all have the same materials. So go ahead and click into the node editor here, and then hit A on your keyboard. It's going to select everything, hit Control-C to copy, and then click on one of the other plates, and then go ahead, click. So when you do that, it's going to open up the default texture for this plate. We're going to hit A, X to delete it, and then Control-V to copy in the new material. However, these two objects, if I hover on over to the material tab, they are not kind of running under the same material. They look the same, but they're not the same like material group, if that makes sense. So now what we're going to do is hit the original plate where it just says metal here, and then we're going to want to select whatever material ID Onshape gave it. So in this case, it's 1230. It'll be different for you. And type in ID 1230, and then that's going to go ahead and select it. So now anything I do to this will affect all of the plates. You can see them moving here. Perfect. So depending on your geometry of what your plates or whatever thing you're doing rather looks like, it might get a little messed up here. For example, this plate looks a lot different than the outer plate. So what we're going to do to fix that is play around with this texture coordinate node. This basically maps it to different kind of geometries within the part. Generate is usually the default, but you can get pretty fancy with like the UV one. For now, we're just going to go ahead and kind of try all of them and see which one looks the best. I'm predicting the object one will look pretty good. And yep, there we go. So now object made all those materials look a lot better. Even on the sides here, we get that nice texture. And we might go ahead and adjust the scaling here a little bit. I think I want to go a little bit smaller, so maybe like a 20. And this, of course, will all depend on what your objects actually are. I'm also going to go ahead and remove the Y here, just because I want the texture to be a little bit stretched out in that direction, just to give it a little bit more realism. But of course, do whatever makes your parts look the best. So now what we're going to do is go ahead and apply the same process to all of the different objects in your scene. So the next big one I see is these beams here. And if you take a close look, if I select like the beam, it says ID 9 here under the materials tab. If I select the screw, it also says ID 9 because we set those to be the same materials in Blender. So the next thing I'm going to do is follow the same process, but do it for the screws. So if I go ahead, pop on over to my Blender Kit add-on, I'm going to type in steel for this one, and then find a nice steel texture. And that one looks pretty good for the screws. We might try a different one. Yeah, okay. I think I like the steel glossy here. So I'm going to go ahead and follow the exact same procedure where I click in the node editor, I click A, Control-C, click on another object with the same material, A, X, and then Control-V, and that'll apply the material to everything I want it to. Perfect. And don't forget to go back and select ID 9 for the one you copied and paste from. So now they're all on the exact same object. Cool. So you should go ahead and do this to pretty much all of your materials in the scene. Depending on how many, this could take a while or could be pretty quick. But just go ahead and find all materials for all your different objects. All right, so I went ahead and applied all materials to my objects. You can see it looks really nice here. And what we want to do now is go ahead and actually render a scene and just make sure everything looks good. So like I said before, my kind of viewport right now is in the preview state. But what we want to do is head to this render state. And it looks a lot worse. That's because we don't have any lighting or any kind of scene set up. The first thing we want to do is change our render engine. So go ahead and hit the render tab, change from Eevee to cycles. And what this is going to do is switch to a different rendering engine that just makes things look a lot better. If you have an NVIDIA, or rather any GPU, you want to go ahead and head to System and just make sure you have your GPU selected for one of these, depending on which applies to you. I have CUDA selected, and then just make sure your preferences save. It should be on autosave, but just hit Save Preferences. Once you do that, I always like to go ahead and hit the denoise button here. That'll just make the viewport look a lot better. And then we can go ahead and start setting up our scene. First, you want to go into the World Properties tab and select the color or the strength to just black or 0. Doesn't matter which one you do. And that'll make the scene completely dark. Next thing we want to do is add a floor. So hit Shift A, hit Mesh, go to Plane, and this is going to add a plane. We can scale this up by hitting the S key and just kind of dragging your mouse, or you can hit, let's say 10, just type in 10 on your keyboard. That's going to add a plane. And then we want to do Shift A, light. Let's do an area light. Hit G on your keyboard and then drag your mouse up to move it. And then it should light your scene just like this. We want to go ahead and edit our scene to have kind of like a sloped wall, like a studio. And if you're having trouble kind of viewing this in this rendered state, you can go ahead and head back to the clay view. It'll speed things up a lot, but I'm going to stay in rendered view. What you want to do now is hit Tab on your keyboard to enter in edit mode, and then go ahead and select the edge mode here. Hit this edge, hold down Shift and hit this edge, and then hit E on your keyboard. This will allow us to extrude these walls up, and then hit Z on your keyboard to only extrude in the Z direction. Kind of move your mouse up until it's a pretty tall wall, and then what we want to do is hit this corner edge here and hit Control B. Then when you move your mouse, it'll make this angle here. Scroll on your mouse wheel, and when you do that, it's going to add a bunch of vertices. You want to make it quite a few vertices just to keep the resolution high. Once you find the number you want, you can go ahead and click and just click. Then you can go ahead and hold down the Alt key on your keyboard, select this edge, and it's going to select all the edges kind of following it. Hit Control B again, and then you can do the same mouse scroll thing. It already kind of pre-selects it here. And then click your keyboard, or rather your mouse, hit Tab to exit edit mode, and now we have this nice studio wall here. We're getting really close to a final render here. I'm just going to go ahead and adjust the lighting. If you hit R on your keyboard, it'll rotate the lights based on the angle that you're kind of looking at it from. Hit G to move the light. I'm just going to kind of adjust it to where I think it looks good by hitting G and R to rotate and move. I'm going to hit Shift D on my keyboard to duplicate the light. And I'm going to change this light by going to the Light Properties tab here and change it to a point light. And then I'm going to make the strength 100. Depending on the size of your objects, your values may vary. And then we can go ahead and kind of move our scene around. You can move this light down by hitting G and then Z, just to move it purely in the Z direction. And then I think this lighting looks pretty good. Yeah. So now I'm going to go ahead and add a camera to my scene. Hit Shift A, hit Camera, and then if you hit 0 on your numpad, it'll enter the camera view. Hit Shift tilde on your keyboard, and then this is going to enter in kind of like a video game style camera view where you can hit WASD on your keyboard. So I'm hitting S to kind of go backwards here, and I'm moving my mouse around. If you hit Q, it'll go vertically down. If you hit E, it'll go vertically up, and you can kind of use WASD to kind of move your camera around in a pretty intuitive way. If your camera is really slow, you can scroll on your mouse wheel, and that'll change the speed that the camera moves. I'm going to go ahead and adjust my camera here. I'm going to change the focal length of the camera to say 25 millimeters, just to make it a little more in scale of what this device actually is. Hit the depth of field button. I'm going to go ahead and select the focus. I'm going to have to bring this way down to get it in focus with the objects. So let's say maybe 5. As you can see here, a lot of it is out of focus, so I'm going to increase the f-stop. This basically adjusts like how much is in focus at a time. And that looks pretty good. If you head on over to the clay view, hit the drop down, and then hit depth of field, you can kind of see what that looks like in a little more detail. So this is out of focus, whereas this is, which looks really good. I'm going to change the ratio to 2, and then that looks a lot better. To make it a little cinematic, I like to change the aspect ratio to like 2300 by 1000, but you can change it to whatever scale you want. And then go ahead and make sure your plane is not intersecting your object. Sometimes by default, it's a little too high up. So you can click on the plane, hit G on your keyboard, and then hit Z, and go ahead and bring that down to the correct spot. So then once you do that, you should have a pretty good render. You can also go ahead and add some materials to the plane itself. Depending on what you're doing. I like to keep it on just flat white, but you can change it to like a metal, for example, and the Blender Kit add-on makes it really easy. You might have to do the scaling trick like I showed before in the node editor just to make it easy, but some of these will look better than others. But like I said, I like to keep it just a plain white. I might go ahead and adjust the metallic of it or something like that. But then once you have this going, you can go ahead and actually render it. So go ahead and hit the render button, hit render image, and then what this is going to do is go through and just render your object with those settings. This video won't cover any like animations of these renders, but you can get pretty fancy with how you want to like kind of zoom the camera around or show it off in different ways. But this is mostly just for the texturing and importing from Onshape into Blender, which I think is usually the hardest part. There are tons of tutorials on YouTube about different ways you can animate your cameras, especially for like product style videos, which is kind of what this is. But once this goes ahead and finishes rendering, then you have your Onshape to Blender tutorial.